Death is back one more time. All right. Again and again. It's been a while. But let's see what Death is up to in this one, starting with the IMDb plot. Plagued by a recurring violent nightmare, not just any kind of nightmare, violent one. A college student returns home to find one person who can break the cycle and save her family from the horrific fate that awaits them. All right. Yes, it's going to get them because it always does. All right. So, yeah, it's been a minute since we had Final Destination, and you know, you guys have maybe caught some of my reviews. You know that usually when there's a franchise that kind of takes a long break and then all of a sudden returns, I kind of like, do we need it? Is it necessary? And, make the usual complaints. But I will file none of those complaints here. I'm a big fan of Final Destination. It was really sad when we thought we had the end of Final Destination and it was finally over. And, they kind of made it really sad, too, with the whole countdown and everything. But it really seemed like, one of these things that didn't necessarily have to end. We didn't have a main, like lead character or whatever that, needed to be killed off and so forth, and maybe some of the other typical stories. I mean, the way this kind of sets up, they could just do this again and again and again and again. So, it's kind of sad to see them kind of pull the plug on it. But happy it's here. Happy it's here, and we'll see what my final thoughts are on this one shortly. But so with this being a new film out here, we'll try to keep it spoiler free. But like I said, this is going to follow a very similar path here. So I don't know that there's huge twists or turns. But I'll leave a thing out or two here that and won't get too specifics into the deaths, so you guys can enjoy all that. But before diving really into this, I just kind of want to start by saying we all know Tony Todd is in here. We know he recently passed away. Rest in peace. He means a lot to a lot of horror fans out there, definitely a horror icon. And, his moment in this film, he has a couple of minutes, very short, segment in this film. Obviously, everybody who's familiar with the franchise knows, he's a reoccurring character in the story, maybe not the main character, but as an important character in many of the movies here. And he has a moment here, and it is very I don't know the appropriate word for it, but it is maybe foreshadowing a little bit, maybe a little bit creepy in itself, but obviously he's talking he talks a little bit about death, obviously, as he does in this franchise, that he always is the character that kind of hints at it. But, what he says in the short time and so forth kind of almost foreshadows his own coming. I don't know, when he did this, his health when he did this. I don't know. It is just a moment that, fans are excited to see him when he comes on screen. Obviously, even though he has a short segment, it's very important what he says in the whole scheme of the movie. But also, besides all that, just knowing, that he's passed, and then what he says and talking about death, it is a little uneasy, to say the least. I don't mean to laugh about it, but it is. And, again, I don't know if he knew, what was going on with his health, his life, and so forth. But it is just weird knowing that's one of his last performances, and, he's talking about death, and he eventually he's gonna pass soon after. It's just, I don't know. Anyway, rest in peace, and thank him. for obviously his role in these movies and obviously many others. All right, with that, moving on to the film itself. So, what do we have here? We'll talk a little bit about that before we get into some thoughts on it. Obviously, Final Destination, we have to have the big grand opening scene here of an event where things are going to go drastically wrong and a bunch of people are going to die, only to be an event that's a dream, whatever, that's about to come true, or a vision, or whatever you want to call it. Here we're going to go back, I think it's the 60s or so, and we see a couple here who is getting into this exclusive new restaurant that's, this kind of restaurant in this tower way up in the sky. And, they're on a date, and, there's a little bit of awkwardness between them. They go in, I think we're kind of seeing it more from the young woman's perspective here, and her feelings and her thoughts. And, they go into the building, they the guy's thinking they have reservations. The guy at the front's like, no, you don't, blah, blah, but they still kind of hang out there. As they kind of scroll through the room and making their way around, we get the kind of Final Destination stuff. We dive right into it. We kind of, the camera's flashing on certain things, hinting at, maybe certain things going wrong, we meet a few characters here or there. They're giving you the usual setup we get here of the eventual disaster that is to come. But we see, the woman being kind of very uneasy the entire time. And before the grand collapse here, he's going to propose to her. She's going to say that she's pregnant. So we're making this, some big, grand, happy moment that is eventually just going to end badly. We get the utter chaos. This whole restaurant is going to basically fall to the floor. And, not all at once. We're going to see, piece by piece, and people die left and right, and all the fun stuff that you guys can expect. So it is, another great scene. I've never really ranked them all. I think everybody kind of has their favorite in the franchise of the plane, the roller coaster, the race cars. Everybody has their kind of, favorite one. I don't think that, this one, does any disservice to anything. It's another great opening, and kind of sets the bar here. So who's going to see this vision? It is, they do something a little bit different here. It's not necessarily a person. This story is not going to be told by someone who's directly in this circumstance. It's actually another young girl that's seeing this vision or dream. And, apparently she's had this dream going on, for a little while now. She keeps seeing this, this going on, and she knows the family member, so she's in college. She eventually goes home, and she's like, hey, I need to get in touch with this person. And I believe it was her grandmother, and her family's like, no, you don't want to talk to her, she's gone nuts and whatever, blah blah, but she just can't get over it. She keeps having this dream and thoughts and whatever, so she eventually reaches out to her grandmother. And her grandmother is obviously the woman who's was in the restaurant. And we find out she eventually saved a bunch of people there, saved most of the people in this building from the collapse because she had the vision and she got everybody out before. So, even though we're following a young girl later who didn't necessarily have it, it did happen. We did have an event that happened that people survived and so forth. So she, when she meets her grandmother's in this house and all protected from death and whatever, and she's, one of the few sole survivors here of that event and who's been able to hold off death all this time. And, she's living in this house that's kind of set up so that she can hide from death. Now, I didn't really complain about, I had a question or two, going along here. in the story here, but it's Final Destination. They're gonna complain and question too much, but I didn't really. They didn't really go into great detail of why Death couldn't kill her in this house, but supposedly it was specially designed so that it couldn't. I don't know. We'll go with it. It seemed like there was a lot of ways Death could have killed this woman in this house, but whatever. It's fine. So the granddaughter and the grandmother here have this conversation, and she tells her, no, Death is going to come for the family, blah blah. You got to protect her. She has this giant book, talking about death and everything that happened from the event of the restaurant falling down, and she gives it to the granddaughter, and the granddaughter still is like, oh, this is ridiculous. No, this can't be what's happening, until the grandmother basically proves that yes, it is happening. So, of course, she takes this back to her family, is like, hey, Death is going to come for us. We're all going to die. And they, of course, are like, no, you're crazy. You're out of your mind. Until they all eventually figure out that, yes, Death is coming for them. And, coming for their bloodline, and so forth. And, this kind of also sets up, and the woman, the grandmother says that Death kind of came for everybody in that restaurant that survived and their bloodlines, because all those people were not supposed to live, were not supposed to have families, and so forth. So Death has come for all of them, and it doesn't really specifically say, but we're made to maybe assume that some of the families that survived that were some of the families that we saw in previous Final Destination movies. There's no direct, saying of it, but, I think you're left to assume. So, we have this whole connection thing. So, it's almost like a prequel, but not really a prequel, kind of just giving an explanation to everything. So, I thought overall, they did a pretty good job with that. I mean, they didn't have to go this route. They could have just been like, hey, we're doing another Final Destination movie, which, like I said at the top, just stick a bunch of people there, have an event, they live, and then kill them later on in the movie. But, instead they kind of went the extra mile here to kind of, give a little bit of extra story, give a background, give, thoughts on, other, why all these other people that we saw die could have died from, and, kind of really defined what Death was, and was the reason Death was going after all these people, and so forth. So, credit that, they kind of went through all that, and it made a decent story here, as opposed to almost, just doing it the simple way, which, like I just said. So, I'll leave, out, what happens. Obviously, Death is going to go after this family and so forth, until the end. So, yeah, who's going to survive? There's a little twist and turn, as there usually is, people trying to dodge Death here, and so forth. And, we get the moment with Tony Todd, very important, moment there that between what the grandmother says and what he says, kind of, puts everything together for the franchise, and explaining, everything that's going on here. But, I think overall it's another fun time. I think we get some great deaths. We get a little bit into, the girl that we're following, and maybe a couple of our family members a little closer than some others. Some die really quickly. We get the usual Final Destination kind of, kind of set up. I think, we got the first preview, teaser, trailer for it, whatever you want to say, which I think many of you have seen. I've shared it a million times, of the barbecue scene and that kind of setup, and it kind of sprinkles throughout, that whole scene and what's going to happen, and kind of give you, is this, is a person going to die from this? Is it going to die from this? Where's Death coming from? One moment something goes off and you're like, oh, that's the moment, no, and it's over here, no, and so forth. So, they do the usual fun stuff there. That scene ended up, pretty okay. There's a scene later in the hospital, which, might have went to a little bit of an extreme, but that was still fun. There's a guy who does piercings, and he's one of the family members, and he does piercings, and that kind of ends up in a very dramatic, crazy scene. Followed by a scene with a garbage truck, which was kind of crazy because the girls like, they're kind of walking down the street and they're like, oh, you can die from this and die from that. And they're like, no, this is all ridiculous, whatever. This is still kind of early on, and it's kind of, funny. I keep seeing, people mention this as horror comedy, or at least it mentioned in reviews. And I don't really see it as comedy. I think maybe that instance there with the garbage truck, and whatever, and maybe in some of the early parts where people are like, hey, this is ridiculous, death is not coming for me, but I think overall, I don't know where people keep mentioning comedy for. I guess if they take the whole, if they're not true horror fans or not hardcore horror fans who take people just dying in ridiculous ways as comedy. I mean, I guess so, but I don't really know what they're talking about. I don't really define this as comedy. Is there a funny moment here or there? Yeah, but comedy, I don't know. I think this is more of, we got death, so that may be a little supernatural, if you want to say, and then, just kind of gore, blood, and guts. I don't know. I mean, whatever. Is there, anything in this movie as far as, a death that, is overwhelming and more than maybe something more spectacular than what we've already seen? Maybe not, but, I think that, it is kind of following the formula, like I said, and kind of the setup, and kind of, is someone going to die by this? Is someone going to die by that? And just kind of driving that tension, driving the suspense. I think, I always think back to the scene, and I forgot which exactly movie it was, but the one where the girl is in the gym, and she's going to do her routine, and then you kind of see this, the screwed fall, the air condition, this and that and the other thing, and then eventually, and you're like, okay, and then she's doing the act, and she's almost going to step on the pen. Is she going to step on it? No, and it kind of goes on a little bit further, and you're like, okay, when is she going to die already? And then, it's kind of that thing, it's not just simply just killing somebody. And I think they do a good job of nailing that here, as well as kind of, dragging out the suspense and, lifting the tension until eventually, bam. Like I said, minor twists and turns, nothing major here. Again, following maybe some of the similar patterns from the other movie. I think at the end, they really, I'm not going to give it away, but the final scene of the movie kind of brings back a very memorable moment. I think for many people who have seen all the ones in the franchise, and obviously you talk to horror fans and so forth, and even people that might not have been horror fans, but maybe remember the movie, always is in the back of their mind because of a certain thing that happens. They have their own take on it. They do a little, they do it in a different way, but, kind of in a similar fashion, similar death kind of way, bringing it back. So I thought that was a very nice way to kind of end it. And again, for me, I'm going to say, that this movie will hopefully do well. And knowing that it does well, maybe opens the door, and maybe they say, hey, let's continue to do some more of these movies. I'm all for it. But kind of the way, it ends, with the way they portray the story and the bloodlines and all these people getting killed, and then kind of the finality here of this family, and then obviously with Tony Todd kind of wrapping it up, and obviously he cannot be in any future movies, unless you're doing the AI computer thing, whatever. But, it almost feels like maybe, in a way that maybe it should end here. Maybe this should have been the ending that it, originally got. So kind of fresh off of it, I'm kind of split. I'm kind of almost like, maybe this is the finale that it should have gotten before. Not that there was anything wrong with it, the way it ended, but it almost seems like, this wouldn't be a bad place for it to end. Obviously, selfishly, I'm like, let's run this back a million times because there's so many things you can do, so much craziness. Obviously, with the great opening scene, and then you guys know I'm all up for the blood and guts and whatever. So, having a movie where a bunch of people are going to die, not going to complain. But, we'll see. We'll see what they do. Money talks, and if it does really well, money might talk itself into more parts. So, I won't complain, but it almost would feel right that it ended here. So, I guess, that will be a question for you horror fans. Once you watch this movie, do you want more, or do you kind of want it to be like, hey, Tony gave us a moment here and kind of, truly finished, the story here and so forth. So that's kind of a thought there. So yeah, I had a good time with it. I enjoyed it. The acting is fine in it. Nothing, blowing you away, but nothing hurting the film. The deaths are good. And they kind of didn't do it. I don't think, the main thing was not to do the franchise any disservice, and I don't think they did. I think, they did a really good job here with everything that they did. So with that, I can't, I don't know that I've reviewed every single Final Destination movie. I don't know if I have or have not. I've been meaning to check, but I have not since I did this review. So I don't know, but I'm going to give this one 4 pools of blood. And that is out of 5. Like I said, nothing really to complain about. Really enjoyed it. I don't think, like I said, maybe I don't give it higher because I don't think it necessarily did anything, hugely better than anything that we hadn't already seen. I think they just did a good job of kind of, giving us a good story here to kind of go into it and bring it back. And then, props to them for kind of following it up and not screwing it up. So with that, that's going to be 4 pools of blood out of 5 for Final Destination, and we'll see if this is really the Final Destination. So with that, Horror's Glory Reviews.blogspot.com is where you can find all of my reviews, written or video. Certainly video reviews for a while now, so you can like and subscribe and do everything else that everybody wants to do here on YouTube. If not, it is okay, no worries. I thank you for your time regardless. Twitter, Facebook information down below as well. Feel free to join me there. Talk about Final Destination all you want. I love it. I'm here for it. And definitely in the comment section, your thoughts on the film, your thoughts on Tony and his performance, and your thoughts on, whether this should be the final one, or would you be welcoming more in, and we'll see what the answer to that is soon enough. So with that, again, I thank you for your time, and I will catch you on the next review, horror fans.